So, good afternoon and welcome to everyone that's in Europe. Good morning to those that are joining us from the other side of the pond, from the Americas, and good evening to those who join from Asia. I'm delighted to. My name is Ruslan Stefanov, and I'm the program director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this second in a series of online panel discussions on the top global issues that face our world today. We went through one on the US elections. This is still going to be in the shade of that, of these ominous elections. But we are looking at Beijing's strategic dilemma, an authoritarian alliances versus economic re-engagement with the world. I will do just a short opening and then turn it over to our great panel and moderator. Just a few notes on housekeeping. So the rules of engagement are, you will see that in the chat. Please post your questions in the chat. You could do that as we go, as the discussion goes on. We will have a panel discussion and then a short discussion afterwards that will answer your questions. So please, you're very much welcome to put your questions in the chat, and we will answer those questions as we go and as the moderator decides to go. The reason we are choosing China and Beijing today to discuss it is clearly that it's omnipresent, and everybody kind of waits to see what direction China is going to take, given that its preeminence in the economy world, given that it's become the second largest economy in the world, given that it is claimed that through BRICS and through other alternative visions of democracy and market economy, that it might reimagine the world. But at the same time, as a discussion at CASD yesterday revealed, in hotspots like Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, China is somehow silent. And at the same time, in the case of Russia, it seems to allow itself to be pushed over on the side of the aggressor, of the larger, more potent side, which of course scares off a lot of the countries, the smaller countries in the world, including a lot in Europe, because as I think Kissinger had said, in Europe, Germany is too big for Europe, but too small for the world. And if Germany is too small for the world, then everybody else is. Now, to cut through the maze of all these discussion of where is it likely that we see China go and what this would mean for our world, we have a great panel today that is inspired by our senior associate fellow, John Bussey, who is also associate editor in New York for the Wall Street Journal, and he will be your moderator today, but also with James McGregor, who is chairman in Greater China at APCO Worldwide and a former China bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. He was also with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China. Andrew Brown, who will join us shortly, partner at Brunswick Group, also former China editor of the Wall Street Journal, and my colleague Martin Vladimir, director of Geoeconomics Task Force at CSD, and also author of the Kremlin Playbook, which looks at this interplay between great powers. We look very much forward to the discussion, and now I leave you in the very capable hands of our moderator today, John Bussey. John, up to you.
Ruslan, thank you very much, and thanks also to the Center for the Study of Democracy for hosting this event. And as Ruslan mentioned, please put your questions in the chat queue. We'll try to get to them during the session, but certainly by the end of the discussion with our panelists. Jim, I'm wondering whether you could provide us with a bit of context. Here we are seemingly at an impasse with China. There's a lot of discussion of conflict with China, competition with China, concern about China. There was a great deal of optimism in the 1990s about China joining the global order. Where were the inflection points where that apparently has gone wrong? Was it with China joining the WTO too soon before there were rule of law based institutions sufficiently formed in China? Was it the U.S. allowing China into the favored nation trading status? Was it a reversal politically in China? How did the optimism of the 1990s turn into the impasse of 2024?
Well, that's an easy one, John. It's complicated, of course. Look, if you go back to the '90s and even the '80s, China's got a lot of very smart people that study the world, and Chinese officials started going around the world, knocking on doors of multinationals, saying, "Hello, I'd like to meet you. Would you like to come to China? You can do a joint venture." And they had studied the industries they wanted, and that came in, and they're doing joint ventures, and a lot of those turned up to be pretty messy because they were with state-owned enterprise that were pretty politically raw and unsophisticated. And then in order to keep the foreign business there, they started allowing to have, wholly owned companies, et cetera. And things were accelerating pretty well and doing very well. Letting China into WTO, as you know, John, I was involved in lobbying on Capitol Hill for that. It seemed to be the right thing to do. And I really think what happened is after China got into the WTO, even very incapable multinationals were doing well in China because the Chinese companies were not there. Zhu Rongji figured that if Chinese companies couldn't win in their own market against multinationals, they wouldn't be able to go global. So he's ready for them to compete. Well, what happened is they couldn't compete. And so the multinationals were sweeping away with market share in China. So then they come in and they put in controls. They say these 24 industries have to be either wholly owned or controlled by state companies. They came in with indigenous innovation, all these technology policies, and China got kind of paranoid and afraid of the West, and that the West had ill intentions on them. From the American business side and the American government side, you go back to Zelek's 2005 speech on the responsible stakeholder. We thought we could shape China's behavior by penalizing certain behaviors and rewarding other behaviors. And what happened basically is China shaped our behavior, at least in the business community. From day one, when businesses were there, are you going to do a joint venture? Are you going to follow these rules? Are you going to hand over your technology, et cetera? They shaped our behavior. And so, but China started really accelerating its adoption of either forced technology transfers or technology theft because they looked at it as an existential threat to be behind in technology. So these companies a lot of companies really got ripped off. They would go to Treasury or Commerce or even in the EU, and they would say, "I'm really unhappy. This is what China's done to my company." And the government would say, "Well, what would you like us to do?" And they go, "Oh, no, don't do anything. I don't want you to mess up my China market share."
Right.
Partly because they're scared of China, and partly because they were arrogant that China could not innovate and they'd be able to stay ahead of them. So let me fast forward to today. Today, the multinationals in China, why are they there? They've long been there for the market. It is the growth market still for a couple more decades. And if you can get access, you want to be in that market. The other reason is Chinese innovation. China's got huge talent, and it's such a competitive market. It does things at China speed. A multinational can come up with an idea and within a year be producing that product, even if it's a complicated product in China. At home, that takes 4 or 5 years. Because it's got to go through so many hoops, innovation. But now the real reason that they talk about they believe their next global competitors coming out of China, because these Chinese companies have gotten very high quality, very sophisticated, and they want to be there to know who they are, how to compete with them, or even to, some of the Europeans now are partnering with these companies in joint ventures, kind of the opposite of what happened when the West went into China. China's going out now, and they're doing joint ventures with multinationals who can help them in the market, know their way around. So things are getting turned on their head right now. One final point is you also got to be in China because China, the West looks for developed markets and puts in sophisticated, high-priced products. China is penetrating the global South very deeply with simplified products, low price points, their own Chinese standards. And so foreign companies now are tapping into that for their manufacturing in the global south. They're learning from China, adopting Chinese standards and going out. So it's a much more complicated world than either Washington or Brussels or London seems to be understanding at this point.
So are those European and American companies competing with China in the global south, or has that turf been left to the Chinese?
They're competing with them and partnering with them. You know, they're going together. There's a lot, thousands of Chinese companies have moved out of China to be, you know, in these markets themselves. Because number one, China is very expensive, and moving out of China gets you around the tariffs that have been imposed. But you know, companies are moving out, and their suppliers are moving out with them. It's a very dynamic situation.
And the companies that are still, and there are many of them that are committed to being in China, how are they now avoiding the technology theft or forced technology transfer? You mentioned indigenous innovation. That was a policy 2020, 2006 of China saying, "Hey, you want to be here? You gotta transfer your technology to us." How are they avoiding that, or are they just embracing it and saying that's a cost of doing business?
Well, actually, China doesn't need to steal technology anymore because they're damn good at creating their own technology. In fact, in many ways, they're ahead of us. You know, because it's just such a brutally competitive atmosphere, and they got so much government support, and you know, and they got, you know, very capable entrepreneurs. It's a very messy process, but it's also can be quite you know, can work quite well. So it's not as simple as that now.
Andy Brown, welcome. Glad that you've joined us. I'm going to turn to Martin next, though. Martin, Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. And it wasn't just a German concept or European. It was very much embraced by the United States and the West in general. You start trading with China, it'll cause the authoritarian nature of the country to slowly become more like us, more democratic. So that hasn't really worked out quite as planned. But you don't hear in Europe discussion of de-risking. You don't hear the words decoupling, containment. There really isn't a sort of conflict-oriented policy that you see emerging in Europe. Germany has expanded its diplomatic relations with countries in the Indo-Pacific, you know, other than China, trying to signal to China that it wants to have sort of balance in Asia. What new ideas on how to address the China impasse, the China threat, the China competition are gaining traction in Europe?
Thanks so much, John, and thank you for the opportunity to address this issue of really economic security for the West, and more particularly the impact on Europe. And thank you for the metaphor of Wandel durch Handel. To me, the way Europe handles the Chinese economic influence on the continent reminds me of the attitude towards Russia 15 years ago. The idea then was, look, we are making quite a lot of money from this relationship because we are importing cheap energy resources and we're investing in a fastly growing market, meaning Russia. So why don't we increase interdependence? And this interdependence in turn will ensure peace and security. This for us, for CSD, in our now probably more than a decade long research of Russian economic presence, has always been delusional, because Russia has always perceived this interdependence as a kind of a judo tactic in which, you know, it can use it to weaken, you know, political systems in Europe. Similarly, we think that China is following the pathway of Russia and has tried to penetrate strategic sectors of the European economy and thus undermine unity in Europe on geostrategic issues, on economic security. And China has tried to enter these areas through the back door through the weakest links, Central and Eastern Europe. And this, in a way, right now has become a major reason for the growing kind of gap between how European countries perceive the Chinese threat. And this provides a strong basis for China to divide and rule in a way. So you cannot find consensus because different countries are pursuing very different national objectives, and they are locking themselves in a relationship with China in a very self-centered way. And a leader in this approach, and I would say right now, the leader in terms of bringing China closer to European strategic markets is Hungary. But it's not only Hungary. We have seen that Germany has somewhat similar position. The Western Balkan countries, not to mention, even France. So this prevents a real concerted economic security strategy to emerge. And what China takes advantage of is our own institutional deficits in terms of competition rules, in terms of public procurement, in terms of the way we handle foreign direct investment screening. There's so many different approaches in Europe, and not the common EU approach has not yet translated into kind of coherent national regulatory systems on foreign direct investment screening. Similarly, there is no attempt on European level to kind of screen outward investments in China. So basically understanding how European companies invest in China. This very much goes back to what Jim was talking about, and the idea that China is very capable of using this foreign investment that comes in to prop up its own industries and its own industrial competitiveness. So there has been a lot of push from the US in the past 4 years to bring the EU on the same page in terms of some kind of screening of these outward investments. And this has been a huge impasse. And actually the EU has pushed back, saying, no, this is the no-go for us. For Europe to remain competitive, we need to allow European companies to get even more exposed to the Chinese market. Otherwise, we cannot really survive in this competition. So this is kind of the mindset that we have seen.
Yeah, I mean, there's disagreement even on how to deal with Russia, right? There's plenty of sanctions evasion, going on in Europe. Is there a center of new thinking on this problem, on this issue, in one setting or another, one institute, one government, one industrial group that says, look, here's how we have to start rethinking our relationship with China, and here's what that rethink is going to look like? Is there that going on?
Yes, to an extent. I think the energy sector and generally all the areas that are linked to the long-term decarbonization of the European economy are right now realizing how much dependent they have become on Chinese equipment, on Chinese raw materials, on that have allowed Chinese manufacturers of EVs and other low carbon technologies to become much more competitive and replace European giants. Europe used to be proud of being number one in this kind of technologies. It's losing its edge. So I think there is a lot of push from the renewable energy sector, from the automobile sector, to think about de-risking because China is growing much faster. And if Europe is to achieve actually its climate neutrality objectives until 2050, right now it doesn't have an alternative, but actually relying even more excessively on China. And there is this dichotomy that is appearing in Europe. How can you achieve decarbonization if you decouple from China, de-risk from China? And I think there is a growing understanding that if we want to achieve both climate neutrality and recover the industrial competitiveness of the continent, we need to limit the exposure to China. We need to limit the penetration of Chinese companies in these strategic sectors because European giants are losing out. So I think this is a moment where we can think that there is a more coherent strategy. More specifically, I wanted to mention that China, in Central and Eastern Europe especially, has been undermining the climate neutrality target. So on the one hand, China is entering the EV market, renewable equipment, batteries, etc. On the other hand, most of Chinese investments, around, I would say, 15 billion in Central and Eastern Europe, are going in fossil fuels, coal power plants, large highways, in generally in projects that increase the carbon intensity of the region. And this is the weakest link in terms of European long-term decarbonization objectives. So there is a very strange pattern in which we need China for decarbonization, but China is also investing a lot in fossil fuels. So we don't know how to really respond to this different challenge.
Andy, when we talk about this situation and the tensions, the growing tensions between governments and business, with China, when we talk about this situation, you say that business and governments need to flip the paradigm. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to what Jim was talking about earlier. You get this sense of cognitive dissonance in thinking about the Chinese economy, that on the one hand, Xi Jinping has taken China on a hard turn towards the state. And it is a top-down, centrally directed system that features a whole-of-nation, mass mobilization approach, huge subsidies. It features centralized product development, centralized R&D, and all under the overall control of the Chinese Communist Party to meet not just economic, but also ideological and political goals. And yet, and this is the crucial part, this system also features raw dog-eat-dog, almost Darwinian capitalism in its most competitive form. And a really good example of this, perhaps the best example of this today, is EVs, where China is by far the global leader. And is the global leader not, as we heard Jim say, because it stole technology, violated IP, but just because of this system that has very successfully married the top-down approach with the market-driven approach. It's quite a compelling approach, and it is very, very hard for the rest of the world to compete with. There was a really interesting story in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford Motor Company, hadn't been to China for a while. A lot of companies haven't been to, CEOs haven't been to China for a while because of the pandemic. So 3 years out, he goes to China, and he is blown away. I mean, really blown away by what he's seeing. He's seeing cars that are so much better than anything that Ford is thinking about producing in the EV space at a fraction of the cost. And so he tells his people, I want a couple of those cars, ship them back to the United States. And he takes them back to Michigan. And he gets his engineers to go all over them, strip them down, figure out what's in there. And the hilarious part of this is that this is exactly what China did to US technology for so many years. That it is true that in its early days, so much of China's economic advance came through forced technology transfer that Martin was talking about, outright theft, cyber attacks on military scale, and using military tools by state players on soft commercial Western targets. And it's not the case at all now, or at least it's not. Of course, it is still a serious problem, but it is not the case that China's
huge state subsidies, huge state subsidies.
More subsidies than perhaps the rest of the world. And so the argument here is that European and US companies need to be somewhat adopt a position of humility here, that in most of the technologies that are going to make the first half of the 21st century, China is either rapidly catching up with Europe and the US or has drawn level, and in some cases, actually many cases, has overtaken. And so there is now a flipping of the paradigm where Western companies really do need to learn from their Chinese competitors. And that goes back again to the point about decoupling. You cannot successfully be a global company today if you are not in this Chinese innovation ecosystem, watching, learning from Chinese companies, because they're going to be your next global competitor.
Decoupling is self-defeating.
I'm sorry?
Decoupling is self-defeating, is what you're saying for these companies.
It is self-defeating, and in many ways, it's impossible. And this is underappreciated because of this narrative. They steal our tech. They can't innovate. It gives a false impression, both to regulators and politicians, most especially politicians in DC, but also, I believe, also in Europe, a false sense of security. So, in the US, we had a case very recently. The White House decided that cranes, shipping cranes, gantry cranes in US ports, made in China, almost all of them made in China, represent a security threat. Got to get rid of them all. Fine. Okay, good. I get that on national security grounds. But here's the problem. The United States no longer makes cranes, okay? Right. And so what to do about it? So now you have teams of people, in government in the US, scrambling for an answer on what to do about cranes. And well, fortunately, it turns out the Japanese still make cranes. There's a company over there called Mitsui. And now the challenge facing the United States is how to persuade Mitsui and other Japanese crane makers to transfer that technology to the US. And beyond that, how to train US workers to produce this equipment. And then you think about, the final cost of these cranes, justified, yes, on national security grounds, but in the end, the additional money spent on these expensive cranes is going to have to come out of other parts of the US economy. And you replicate that again and again in areas of technology. We could go into shipbuilding, we could go into many different areas where the US industrial capabilities over the years have atrophied when China has been racing ahead.
Yeah, atrophied. It actually got moved to Mexico and to China because it was cheaper to build there. I just want to encourage people, if you have a question for our panel, to put it in the chat queue, and we will aim to get to it. Andy, before we leave this notion of flipping the paradigm, you mentioned Ford. Who's good at it from a company standpoint and a government economic policy standpoint? Is there a country out there that's kind of out ahead on this notion and saying engage, learn from the Chinese just like they learn from us at a government level? And is there a company or two that sort of stands out in your mind as doing it right?
Well, on a company level, there aren't that many examples because this is really quite a recent phenomenon. One company that comes to mind is a company that Jim and I both know very well, which is Cummins Engines. And this was a classic example. Cummins, over the years, had developed literally the last word in diesel engines. They lasted forever. They were engineered to—
Huge, important US company.
Yeah, systemically important, totemic, iconic US company that had by far the best technology in its space, and operated at a premium end of the market. Came to China. Guess what? The Chinese didn't want this over-engineered product. They wanted something that was much more basic. Your Chinese investment horizon doesn't go out much beyond 2-3 years. The US investment horizon is much longer. And so Cummins came into China, worked with JV partners, actually, if you like, this is a crude way of putting it, dumbed down their technology, made it appropriate for the global South, and now with partners is all over the world selling Cummins newly engineered Cummins appropriate for the technology and the companies, the emerging economies in which it's now operating. And I would just say that from the perspective of countries, I think the global South get this completely, that China has become a key, essential partner, certainly in terms of a trading partner. It's the largest trading partner to most countries in the world, and a supplier of technology, appropriate technology, in addition, of course, to the infrastructure that it puts in through Belt and Road and other initiatives.
John, let me add a little to this, because there's a lot of multinationals in China that are doing well and they're very smart, but they're not talking about it. The pharmaceutical companies, medical devices, all kinds of manufacturing, they're there and they're moving along. They're not doing the huge investments anymore, but they're still moving ahead in that market. They're trimming down what didn't work. They're recalibrating, and they're keeping very quiet about it. Companies used to highlight what they were doing in China to boost their stock price. Now they're scared of talking about it because they don't want to get Gallagher. They don't want the select committee going after them in Washington, or people in Europe going after them. And they're in a difficult position because China's being nicer to them than ever before because the Chinese economy is in trouble. So if you're running a multinational in China, you are seeing opportunities. Your board is seeing a threat. And so there's this this tension there. But a lot of these companies are moving ahead very quietly, and they're not talking about it. Again, not moving ahead in huge ways, but they're inching ahead and right-sizing their business.
So, Jim, tariffs are all the rage politically in the United States at the moment, particularly with the Republican Party. Tariffs will solve the West's problems. The tariffs will make American companies and European companies possibly competitive again, just by charging companies in China for the products that they're seeking to export, putting a tax on them. Japan faced similar tensions in the 1980s with the auto industry. It built out a kind of a latter-day co-prosperity sphere in Southeast Asia to build product there and ship it to the United States, eventually building factories in the US as well. Studies have shown that tariffs are kind of fighting the last trade war. I mean, this was something maybe we should have done 20 years ago. Is there any reason to believe that tariffs would work with China, or were they just tariffs as well as export restrictions, like the restrictions the US has put on chip making machinery? Is that just going to accelerate China building out manufacturing capability in other countries to ship to the US, China developing the technology on their own at home?
Yes, it already's happened. Thousands of Chinese companies have moved out of China, as I said earlier, because China is quite expensive compared to some other countries, and also to get around the tariffs. And those tariffs are paid by American consumers. They're not paid by China. They're paid by by American consumers. It makes no. I'm not an economist, but it makes no sense. It's not doing anybody any good. And Andy, I'd like to hear your opinion on this too. But we are fighting the last battle. You know what you need to do? We need to compete with China. We need to get our act together and compete. Instead of trying to stop them, we're spending so much time trying to stop them, which is going to accelerate their progress. We got to focus on what we need to do to move ahead. And look, we gave up our manufacturing. McKinsey, Goldman, the Reagan administration, the Milton Friedman School of Economics, government's a problem, free market solve all problems. We shipped all our manufacturing overseas very quickly, and we lost that ability. We got a messed up immigration system, so we're not creating the workers we need for these factories. We got to get our act together. That's how you compete against China.
But Andy, is it as easy as Jim suggests, or would we need hundreds of billions of dollars of state subsidies for select industries to properly compete with China the way that China competes with the rest of the world?
But we're already getting those state subsidies. I mean, under the IRA, or rather under Chips and Science Act for semiconductors, we've got $50 billion of government investment, which has crowded in $400 billion of private investment. But, you know, to Jim's point, I'm not an economist either, okay? But Economics 101 tells you that the first impact on sanctions of tariffs on China is that you raise the value of your currency. In the U.S. case, the value of the U.S. dollar. This rebounds on your exporters. And exporters get hammered in two ways. Firstly, because the dollar is strong. But second of all, their inputs go up because many of their inputs come from China. And the China content of US exports is actually, in some sectors, is actually quite high. And then again, to Jim's point, businesses have ways around this. I mean, Mexico has overtaken China as the U.S. largest trading partner, and part of this, a large part of this, is because manufacturers have decanted out of China and into Mexico to get around these tariff restrictions. I would say tariffs are important and necessary in selected areas, and we need to be very careful about delineating those areas. So, for instance, on EVs, I can see the case for putting a tariff of 100%, or as Trump is threatening, 200% on Chinese EVs, just to keep them out of the US altogether, in order to buy time for Detroit to come up with products that are competitive against those that might come in from China. But I fear that the response from Detroit is not going to be that at all, and they're going to stick with what they know works and what makes them a lot of money, which is trucks and SUVs. So I think that comes then back down to issues around regulation. Are we going to be smart about tariffs? And are we going to use that in order to transform Western economies in order to, as the Chinese used to say, self-strengthen and give ourselves the ability to compete against an economy that is increasingly at the leading edge?
Martin, Matt Pottinger, the former deputy national security advisor to Trump, and also basically the architect of the Trump administration's China policy. Also, I should add, a former Wall Street Journal reporter in China. There's a big Wall Street Journal mafia here, it seems. He wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs this summer in which he says, forget about mollifying China, forget about trying to stay even with China. We need to win this competition, and we need to get very aggressive toward that end. We need to take the gloves off with tariffs. We should kick China out of most favored nation trading status. We need to restrict investment in China. We need to restrict the transfer of financial resources to China that fuel their economy and fuel their own investment. We need to beef up spending on Taiwan defense, double our own defense spending. Victory is the mission. Would that policy, this more aggressive take on China, gloves off, would that resonate in Europe? Would it get traction with US allies in Europe?
I think this is realistically impossible at the moment. And I think European countries have been very clear about that they're not going to go all the way in. Even talking about de-risking is very sensitive in Europe. What if we talk about, embargoes, basically? I don't think this is happening, but I think it's more important to note how China fits into a broader geoeconomic kind of competition, which involves also Russia and other authoritarian countries. And that's where I think Europe can be brought to to the same side. I think where the US and Europe can coordinate better in kind of countering the growth of malign Chinese economic influence and political influence is where China and Russia are partnering across the world, in Africa, in Latin America, because what we are seeing right now is that, first of all, of course, China is helping massively Russia in evading sanctions. That's clear. but they're also partnering together in capturing strategic sectors and strategic areas of decision-making in the global south, although this is not a great term, but in all of these countries that have been on the fence, on Ukraine, on Taiwan, on human rights, on democratic backsliding, in exactly these weak spots, weak links, China and Russia have been partnering very successfully on things like lithium exploration in Bolivia, for example, road infrastructure building in Central Africa, in oil and gas exploration and production, nuclear technology, Argentina and elsewhere. So in these countries, which are very often cash-strapped, and they are also very annoyed by the number of conditionalities that the West imposes on certain investments or multilateral financial aid, that they're very much willing to go ahead in this partnership, especially when they gain recognition internationally from and being part of this club, BRICS, which might not mean much to the West, but to these countries, these governments, it means a lot, and they can boost their domestic political standing by showcasing how they have been good. They have grown in their partnerships with China and Russia, and they have become international players in this way. So we need to kind of find a way to bring back the developing countries on the Western side of this geoeconomic competition. And we need to be more strategic and smart about our investments there. We are so bureaucratic, the West, in the ways we channel, investments and financial aid to these places, that we lose them very often. We lose these governments, and they prefer to go with a country like China, which is not going to question, corruption in public procurement, is not going to question authoritarian tendencies of the government, but would provide large loans which have long-term consequences, and they will come back to bite these countries. But at the current moment, they actually help these governments, many of them authoritarian, to stabilize their support on the ground and improve the economic outlook.
Don't we have international institutions that are supposed to be doing exactly what you're describing, the World Bank, IMF, other groups?
Yes, but they have lost significantly their leverage, and they don't have the economic firepower to actually compete with Chinese investment and with Russian geopolitical muscle, because Russia doesn't have the finances, but it has this kind of international political standing that it can provide in many cases to these countries. So we need to find a way to bring constructive capital to these regions. And one way to do it is to work with governments to create more enabling conditions, institutional reforms that would attract Western investment. But this Western investment is not going to arrive in these places if we don't also provide them with specific geostrategic kind of guarantees, like security guarantees, that they can go and operate in these locations without fearing that they're going to be sidelined by competition from China and Russia. Like, for example, I keep on mentioning Bolivia because it's such an obvious case how China and Russia just basically wiped out all Western competition for their vast lithium resources in these cutting-edge areas, which are going to determine the pace of industrial transformation. That's where China is much more strategic than us.
Right. Jim, Andy, I wonder whether you could reflect on the Matt Pottinger scenario. A much tougher line with China, much more aggressive strategy on dealing with China. Is that something that you think would get traction with a new administration if it's, for example, a Trump administration? Or is this also been passed by history that we simply are in a different state of play with China now? This would not work.
Well, actually, Andy was with Matt last week, so he's got fresher ideas. I'll let Andy take it away.
I was with Matt last week, and we were talking about some of these issues. And he's written in Foreign Affairs that, you know, we're in a new Cold War. I think that is definitely an aspect of our current predicament. I also think that it's fundamentally the wrong way in some ways to think about it, primarily because the Cold War had a winner and the Cold War had a loser. And, you know, the good guys won. And in this competition with China, there is no winner. And one way or another, given that we're not going to change China, and I don't believe that belligerence, I don't believe that aggression, I don't believe that containment is going to work. I think that we need to focus far more of our efforts on reviving our own democracies, on managing our own economies better, on reducing wealth disparities, on reducing political polarization and all the other systemic problems that prevent us from competing economically and in the ideological space against China. But I think the answer to this question also connects to what Martin was just saying, and that is competition for hearts and minds in the developing world. The developing world does not want the West to get into an open-ended confrontation with China. They don't want to have to choose. And indeed, the most successful economies in the world today, the real nodes of growth, whether that's India, whether that's in the Gulf, whether that's in Southeast Asia, whether that's in parts of Latin America, are these countries that are able to very adeptly play both superpowers against each other. And, you know, in this competition, China has a lot of sway. You know, Martin was talking about China's attraction. Well, it is the case that China is by far the largest supplier of credit to the world, including to the global South. The China Development Bank, Exim Bank, other Chinese institutions dwarf lending from the IMF and the World Bank. The World Bank got out of the business of infrastructure a long time ago. China, through its $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative, is actually building needed infrastructure in developing countries that are thirsty for economic development. And the answer to this is, from the US side at least, soggy notions about, you know, technological standards and resilient supply chains and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, China is out as there was a very famous quote from an African finance minister, I think it was, at Davos last year or the year before, and he said, you know, the Chinese give us bridges and highways, the Americans give us lectures about human rights, but the West needs to get back into the business of hard infrastructure, real aid for countries in order to compete with a very, very competitive program from China that's aimed not just at spreading Chinese wealth and development around the world, but also Chinese authoritarian values.
We have this rather specific question from Ryan McLaren, but maybe we can use it to broaden a little bit to security in the Pacific and touch a little bit more deeply on Taiwan. Ryan notes that the UK has just decided to relinquish control of some islands in the Indian Ocean to Mauritius, which China views as a potential geopolitical partner. However, the US and UK have insisted on keeping a base which houses military aircraft and naval ships on one of the islands. Are certain US Republicans correct in their conclusions that this is a mistake and allows China to threaten Western interests in the region? Or related to this, does it represent another potential flashpoint, such as the South China Sea? Andy, I'm not sure whether you've been closely following islands in the Indian Ocean, but I'm gonna bounce that to you just so that we could talk maybe a little bit about what is going on in this region and in the South China Sea and in the conflicts between China and the Philippines, and how does that sort of frame the Taiwan issue, if it does frame the Taiwan issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me make a confession. I have to say, to my shame, that I'm not up to speed on the islands that Ryan is talking about, for which apologies. As soon as this call is finished, I'm going to start looking at that because it sounds really interesting. I have spent, though, quite a few years thinking about, writing about, observing, traveling around Asia, and particularly about the South China Sea. And, you know, I think the South China Sea, and I think that this does have salience, it does have relevance to what's happening in the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea is becoming a Chinese lake, and that is the way that China would like to view it. And it is a big deal. It is a very big deal because it is a direct challenge to the global order. And, you know, we have to understand that our order is primarily a maritime order, that most of the goods shipped around the world are shipped over oceans. Almost all of the internet traffic of the world goes through undersea internet cables. The sea is a rich source of protein for most of the world's population. Under the seabed, you have vast quantities of oil, gas, and minerals, and so on. And I think it is in this context that one has to look at what China is doing in the South China Sea in building these massive artificial islands, and in recent weeks harassing the Philippines around these some of these artificial islands that are within China's economic exclusion zone. You know, and this is entirely counter to international law, as expressed in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. A reef is a reef is a reef. It will never be an island under international law, no matter what you do, no matter what you build on top of it. You can build deep sea ports, you can build airfields, you can build missile emplacements. It doesn't change the reality that a reef is a reef. China's building these artificial islands and then declaring no-go zones around those reefs, again, in contravention of international law. At the same time, and I think this is also relevant to what's happening in the South China Sea, is that we're seeing the biggest buildup of military power by any country since World War II. And the advances that China is making on the military front, the rapidity, the scope, the scale of these advances is really quite extraordinary. I mean, just in the last 4 years, China has doubled the number of its nuclear warheads. China has more than doubled the number of its ballistic and cruise missiles. China has added 400 advanced fighter planes, and so on and so forth. It is a truism, of course, that military power is downstream of industrial power. And this relates back to what we were talking about at the start of this conversation, which is China's industrial advance. And when you have an economy that has an industrial base larger than the United States and Europe put together, and accounts for 1/3 of global manufacturing, you end up with an awesome military power and an ability to spread that power, to throw that power into China's, what it calls its near abroad, the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and then further afield.
John, let me add just a little bit. What really, but let's look at the big picture of this. A dozen years ago, China was partners with the United States. They were partners with Europe. There was a lot of problems and issues, but there was some trust and some partnership and some working together. Where are we now? China has isolated itself from the world, by hooking up with Putin. I mean, now it's Putin, it's Syria, it's North Korea, it's Iran. The Chinese people are not there. The Chinese people are international. They want to be all over the world. All of a sudden, they are being dialed back into being isolated, and China's lost its goodwill around the world with this hard power everywhere and pushing everybody, whether it's in Nepal or in the South China Sea or Taiwan or in Europe. And so I don't know how sustainable this is, because it's not where the Chinese people are. I lived in China for 30 years. The Chinese people are pretty open-minded and want to be part of the world, and so do Chinese officials. I've never had a Chinese mother say to me, "I can't wait for my daughter to go to college in Moscow." No, they want to be all over the world, and they are now being isolated. Just the last couple of weeks, then school teachers across China are losing their passports. The government is taking away their passports for a middle school teacher in Wuhan. There's a danger of them going overseas and learning something. I mean, this is a country that is closing in on itself, and a people that do not want to do that. Rich people are leaving. So this is, we can't think that this is going to go on forever, because it doesn't have popular support. It's got fearful support.
And here's a related question from Lisa Peterson. Martin, I'll send this one your way to start with. How can the EU, USA respond to China's human rights abuses, knowing that China has caught up or even overtaken the US and EU in corporate development and become an important trading partner? How can the EU and USA respond to China's human rights abuses?
Well, this is, I think, very important question, because, I mean, China and Russia have referred to their relationship as a partnership with no limits. And for Europe, and even more so for Ukraine, this means trouble, and it means increasing economic and political risk. So I think Europe needs to manage these types of risks together with the US. I mean, first of all, most importantly, Europe and the US should be on the same page, because this is not the case right now on China. And many European countries are willing to close their eyes to human rights abuses in China in order to preserve the economic relationship. So there needs to be some kind of red lines put together, which are coordinated between Brussels and Washington very clearly, and they need to be consistent. And the attempt by China, like previously Russia tried, and currently tries, of course, to sow divisions within political systems in Europe by supporting, far-right movements, fringe parties, and create dichotomies and false narratives. China is doing similar things on issues related to its kind of neighborhood and its human rights track record. You see politicians in Europe kind of being paid by China to do that. So we need to set the same limits we have set on Russian interference in Europe, or trying to at least counter it. By the way, the European Commission is going to include sanctions on entities and people who are engaged in kind of hybrid warfare by Russia in Europe. We need a similar approach on China. We don't have that now. We have 27 different strategies. Some are more assertive in countering Russian malign influence, like Lithuania. And these countries sometimes are left on their own. So when Lithuania talked about human rights abuses and tried to kind of limit its trade exposure to China, China reciprocated with an embargo. So China can pick and choose who to work with in Europe if we don't have a common kind of political understanding of what we're going to do. And this has to happen together with the US, because if Europe is left on its own, I don't think China, I don't think it can preserve its unity on these issues.
Jim, Andy, we have 60 seconds left. Do you want to jump in on that last question? How does the US balance its sort of moral imperatives and sort of value-based leadership in the world on the human rights issue against its economic necessities with China? How does that happen?
Well, I'll be very quick. Moving back to the U.S. A few years ago, I'm wondering that whether we have the real strong standing to go after others on human rights when we have school shootings and all that. We have to get our act together. We have to show the world a way of living, not tell the world how to live. We got to get back to our basics on having a society that looks out for everybody.
I would just say in a few seconds, arguably the West gave up its leverage on China when it comes to human rights, when it ushered China into the World Trade Organization, gave it most favored nation trading status, and helped propel China towards its current status as the world's second largest economy. Sanctions regimes have very limited utility there is a regime now against Xinjiang, 1/6 of China's landmass, against cotton, against other forms of, against other products made through quote unquote slave labor. But we've seen how sanctions regimes are so easily circumvented. We saw that most clearly, obviously, with Russia and Ukraine. I would just finally say it does not help when you have the president of the United States, former President Donald Trump, Matt Pottinger's ex-boss, sitting with Xi Jinping in Kyoto, according to reliable accounts, and sympathizing with Xi at the problems of terrorism that he's facing in Xinjiang, and bemoaning the fact that Hong Kong, with all the demonstrations that were going on at the time, was such a difficult problem to handle. And I think finally, Jim is absolutely right. The real answer to this is to shore up our own democracies.
Well, that's going to have to be our last word. I want to thank our participants for your very good questions that you sent in. Thank you to Martin and to Jim and to Andy and to Ruslan and the Center for the Study of Democracy for participating in and hosting this event. And that concludes our session. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.